Kerry Kennedy is the president of the Robert Kennedy Human Rights, created in 1968 by her mother, Ethel, to carry on Senator Bob Kennedy's legacy and forge ahead with his unfinished work, all in pursuit of the dream of a more just and peaceful world. As you all know, Ethel died, her mother, just a few days ago. You must have seen the news, you've seen the news about the funeral. 3 presidents were attending just a few days ago, Clinton, Obama, and Biden. And so I would ask you to take just 1 second to pay homage to this great American political figure, Ethel Kennedy. Thank you. And Kerry, also thank you for having kept your commitment on this difficult time for your family, I would say in true Kennedy spirit. Kerry is a human rights activist, a lawyer. In fact, she's a member of the Massachusetts and District of Columbia bars. She's a graduate of Brown University, Boston Law College. She holds honorary doctorate of law, and she's an author. Let me just mention 1 book that was on the New York Times bestseller list, which is Being Catholic Now. The 7th of Ethel and Robert Kennedy, 11 children. Kerry Kennedy has devoted more than 40 years to the pursuit of equal justice, the promotion and protection of basic rights, and the preservation of the rule of law. She works on a range of issues, including child labor, women's rights, disappearances, indigenous land rights, judicial independence, freedom of expression, ethnic violence, criminal justice, and environmental justice. Kerry served as chair of the Amnesty International USA Leadership Council for over a decade. She serves on the board of directors of the United States Institute of Peace and many, many more. Her own foundation has offices in Greece, UK, Spain, Switzerland, and Italy. In fact, Kerry is leaving, Kerry, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're leaving this evening, tonight, to go to Italy, where she will open the 3rd office that the foundation has in our country, the others being in Florence and Milan. I think it's great that, Kerry, that you are expanding into southern Italy and Naples in particular, which is a wonderful, one of the old capitals of Italy, wonderful, wonderful town. Italy, you know, in Italy, the foundation has several members that are friends of Jay, that are supporting it, and in particular Stefano Lucchini, who is the chair of the foundation, Antonino Mattarella is the treasurer, Enzo Manes, Marialina Marcucci, Pietro Salini, just to mention a few, are sitting on her board. She's the proud mother of 3 daughters, Cara, Mariah, and Michaela. And Mariah and just got married recently. I just saw the pictures, they were beautiful. I remember Mariah many, many years ago when we went around with Kerry and my daughter and others to do canvassing in Pennsylvania, which was a wonderful experience. It was in 2008, I think. It was at the time of the Obama election. Much different political atmosphere and mood atmosphere. She has received honors from President Lech Walesa of Poland for aiding the Solidarity Movement, the Humanitarian Award from the Congress of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, and many other honors. Please welcome Kerry Kennedy. So, before we start, and I think, you know, this is quite important also to reflect on the mood of the countries. I'd like to talk a moment about Ethel Kennedy and what her mission has been. She died on Thursday, October 10th, so literally 10 days ago. She was 96. There were wonderful obituaries everywhere. I took a couple of excerpts just to give a little bit of a sense of who she was, and I'm sure you know it already, but I think it's great to remember her. On the New York Times obituary. And so this is what the New York Times wrote at a certain point. So Ethel was a den mother, ringmaster, chief practical joker, and seasoned political pro at Hickory Hill. Hickory Hill is the legendary home that you had out just outside Washington. The place was a beehive where Washington kingmakers, Hollywood stars, Nobel Prize winners, and neighborhood children swarmed, not to mention a bustling menagerie that once included a sea lion in the swimming pool. Mrs. Kennedy watched as the singer Harry Belafonte danced with his wife Julie at a private reception in New York in 1962 and persuaded him to teach guests the twist, which of course was a popular dance at the time, but I think we all still know it. In Robert Kennedy and His Times, a book that came out in 1978, Arthur Schlesinger, the famed historian, part of the Kennedy entourage and part of the White House of John Kennedy, wrote that André Malraux, the French author, intellectual, and statesman, took it all in and observed, this house is heads a popping. So clearly we get the impression of the force of nature and this wonderful atmosphere. After her husband's murder, Ethel lived out of the family maxim right immediately. I'm sure you remember at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles in 1968, June 1968, when Shiram killed Bob Kennedy during the primaries of the time. And the maxim is Kennedy don't cry. On the plane that carried her husband's body to New York from Los Angeles, Mrs. Kennedy walked the aisle, making sure everyone had a blanket or pillow. On the long train ride to Washington for the burial, she spoke to many of the 1,100 passengers and waved to thousands of onlookers along the route from a window next to the coffin. One passenger was Coretta's Con King, whose own husband, the Reverend Martin Luther King, had been assassinated only 2 months earlier. I don't see how she has been able to go through this awful experience with so much dignity, Mrs. King said on the train. So this was Ethel Kennedy again, please. I think we should give her a round of applause. I think one point that comes out is thinking back, it's the different mood of the country. Yes, there were 2 assassinations that year. Thank God we didn't have them. We did have some attempts assassination. But the country was more together. Everybody came together. There was no celebration. There was, we think today, the country being so polarized, who knows what would happen if something horrible should happen to one of the candidates. But the mood was different, Kerry. I think you probably agree on that. And my first question today is thinking about these elections is, first I would ask you to have a thought about your mother, actually, if you can. I mean, we saw she was a force of nature, but she was able to keep everything together. I remember that she also went to see Wallace when he himself, George Wallace, a racist from the South, had been the object of an assassination attempt, and she went and visited him to the hospital. I'm not sure whether this would happen today. So tell us a bit about your mother and those years and those times.
Well, first, is this on?
Let's see.
Is it on now? Is it on?
Yes, it's on.
Thanks. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to see so many old friends and meet new ones. So thank you very, very much. One of my earliest memories is going to the Justice Department when my father was the Attorney General. And I have 10 brothers and sisters, 11 of us all together. And my mother would put 6 or 7 kids into the back of her convertible and 2 or 3 dogs, and not just like little lap dogs, huge Newfoundlands and sheepdogs, and always a football. And we would go down to Washington to see my father, and we'd always go up and see him in his office. He had a huge office like the size of this room, and an office you could throw a football across. So we would play football with him a little bit, and then we always went down you could go to the basement of the Justice Department. There was a tunnel that brought you to the FBI building. And in the basement of the FBI building is where the sharpshooters practiced. So we loved to watch the sharpshooters in practice. And one day when we were there, my mother noticed a suggestion box. And so she took out her telltale red pen and she wrote this suggestion, she stuffed it in the box. Now, at that time, the head of the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover. Does anyone remember J. Edgar Hoover?
Yes.
Okay, so as you will recall, J. Edgar Hoover was not known for his love of children or his sense of humor. And so, an astute FBI agent picked up that message and ran it up to Hoover's office, who immediately had it sent to my dad's office. Meanwhile, my mother was organizing all the kids and the dogs and the football. And then she brought us back up to Daddy's office. So when we were walking in, Daddy was reading the suggestion, and the suggestion was, get a new director. So this was a very early kind of lesson in both having a sense of humor and also speaking truth to power. And those sorts of lessons that stuck with me.
And again, you're talking, it was a wonderful, people have memories of being before all the awful things that happened, but it being a wonderful time. So let's go back to the mood of the country. Something has changed. The country is polarized. It doesn't seem that a dialogue is possible. It's not possible in Congress, it's not possible during the campaign. And so what do you think has changed in this country?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because people feel like our country has never been so divided. Of course, that's not true. We had a civil war. And then when my father ran in 1968, just think back to that time. The main message of his campaign was bringing people together, was healing division. And this is a time when there's no social media, when we only had 3 networks. Between when my father was killed and 5 years earlier, Uncle Jack was killed, the President of the United States, which was such a shock. Medgar Evers was killed, one of our great civil rights activists. Malcolm X was killed, Martin Luther King was killed, and then my father was killed. So there was a lot of fear in our country and a lot of feeling of that there was a huge division. And then we had enormous divisions at a time between black and white with the civil rights division, between old and young, and people who were for the Vietnam War and who were against it. Now think about this. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was killed. That night, 125 cities in our country went up in flames. So if you think we're divided now, just think about that. Dover, Delaware was under martial law for 9 months. So we were divided, and we were starkly divided, and it was a scary time. And think about the Democratic Convention and the police versus the demonstrators. What happens next? My father, of course, died. Most historians say that he would have gone on to get the Democratic nomination. Johnson had opted out, and that he would have beaten Nixon. Okay, think about this. No Nixon, no Watergate. Vietnam went on for another 4 years. All those people killed who would not have been killed. So all that trauma from all those families who had their sons die in Vietnam. And then Nixon started what's called the Southern Strategy. Do you guys know about the Southern Strategy? Okay, so some people are nodding their heads. So the Southern Strategy was Nixon saying, here we have an opportunity. When Johnson signed this, am I talking too long? So when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he famously said, there goes the South. And what he meant by that is that, you see, the Democrats, the Republicans were the side of Lincoln. That was the party of Lincoln. So the blacks were Republicans, and the racists were Democrats. And the racists controlled the white Southern racists controlled the Democratic Party. They controlled the slave states. And so what happened is Nixon said, we have a chance for a switch. We should use the race card to bring the white supremacist Southerners over to our side, and that's exactly what's happened. That's why if you look at a map today of Republican control, and you put that on top of a map of the slave states, they are exactly the same map. And so the blacks went for the Democrats because of what Daddy did and Daddy and Jack did in releasing and getting Martin Luther King released from the Birmingham jail right before the election, and then because of all my father's work in the civil rights movement, of course, in conjunction with Uncle Jack. But that was the switch. And then each succeeding Republican president has taken that policy and made it more and more explicit and used race more and more radically. And this is how you get to Donald Trump. But if you look, that is a absolute through line through their politics, through their rhetoric, and what they're willing to say. And Trump says it more explicitly, does it more openly, and uses it more nefariously in a way that is extremely dangerous for our country and for our world.
Yeah. No, in fact, you know, the
Sorry,
word.
that was a
No,
long answer.
It was very interesting. Thank you. It's always important. We forget the importance of history, so it's always important to get a context. But you're absolutely right that the Republican Party started to move further to the right. You know, the moments there was Newt Gingrich and the Christian Alliance and so on and so forth, and then things got progressively to the right. But the difference between today and back then, I think, is that some are really questioning the efficiency of democracy. And we see this at a wider level internationally, where there are two factions. On the one hand, the autocrats that are fighting, basically the autocracies that are fighting democracies, in the larger scheme. And nobody probably thought that this would have happened in America. There might have been difference of violence, maybe on issues, but not on what the fundamental values of the Constitution were. And yet this is happening somehow. So one question that that many people have is, but how come Trump is able, after what he's done, we've seen in the press, he's been in court and he has used very strong terms and so on and so forth, he's still very popular. So my question to you, you're a human rights activist, is that whether in the name of civil rights, the pendulum has swung too far. And, towards, for example, protecting minorities at the expenses of the majority. We have many examples in California, prosecutors refuse to prosecute petty theft and so on and so forth. People are afraid to walk into an elevator because, of what they may be accused by a woman and a man. She will say, oh, he did something and he may be fired. The memos in a company will have whether, the way you are addressed, and people are becoming a little confused about all of this. So the question to you is, do you think that that has happened? And do you think that many people in America are worried about how much the pendulum has swung in one direction, and therefore they think that Trump, who is the only one that is able to say whatever he wants, in whichever way he wants, he interrupts, a rally to talk about Palmer and his sexual, capabilities, and yet he still gets lots of attention and public and the front page of the newspaper. So, do you think, as a human rights activist, that has moved too far?
Well, this is what I think has happened. I think, and what I'm going to say applies to the U.S., but I think it also applies to Italy. And you can be the judge of that. But basically, there are a lot of Americans who believe that they had a deal, a covenant with America. And most of them are white, and most of them are men. And a lot of them in the middle of our country. But basically, that deal was, if you stay out of trouble until you're 18 or 19, you finish high school, we're gonna give you a job. It's gonna be a back-breaking, mind-numbing job. Either we're going to shove you down a coal mine at 18 and we won't let you out until you're 65 and you're gonna die from black lung disease at 67, or we're gonna send you to a factory and you'll be doing this for the next 40 years. And, but if you do that, we're gonna give you certain things, and we're gonna give you a job you can rely on for the rest of your life. We're going to give you, you'll be in a union, so you'll make decent wages. You'll be able to buy a house that you can live in and that you can pass on to your children. We're gonna invest in your children's education, so they'll have a better job than you do. You'll be in a community that you will love, and you'll be building the richest and most powerful country on earth, the United States of America, so you can be proud of what you've done. And so they took that deal, and then they worked in that factory until their backs were broken, their lungs were full of disease, and then the factory moved overseas. Then they couldn't get a job because we broke the unions. So the best job they can get is in Walmart, and they're making $7.50 an hour instead of $40 an hour that they were making in the coal mine. And in 2008, the financial crisis struck, and their house, they don't own their house, but their house is owned by the bank. And it's underwater with their loans, so they're not gonna pass that on to their kids. And then we didn't invest in their children's education, so their kids are not gonna have a better job than they do. Those jobs don't exist. And then their communities are full of opioids. Their brother-in-law has it, their child has it, their best friend has it, and that's terrifying. And then we are not going to be the richest, most powerful country on earth. China is, and China's our enemy. So they're mad. Now, that's the economic piece of it. At the same time, if I can go on a little bit, at the same time that's happening, there's a social piece of it. And that's what you're referring to. And there's somebody who's saying blacks are as good as whites, putting their finger right in their nose. Blacks are as good as whites, and women are as good as men, and boys can marry boys, and girls can marry girls. And your 13-year-old daughter can get pregnant and walk down the street and have an abortion, and you have to pay for it out of your tax dollars, and she never has to tell you about it. And, this goes on and on and on. And these are important things. That's good that our country has changed in those ways. But if they're not your values, And they're at the same time as that economic displacement, it's scary and people are angry. So, one more piece. So it's like being
And I'm sorry, but I'm not referring just, of course, to, women and blacks, etc., etc. I was referring to, to what Ocasio-Cortez and a whole new left wing of the Democratic Party came up with.
Yeah, I don't think that's the problem here. I think I'm talking about the heart of the problem.
Okay.
So it's like here we are in New York, you're living in the basement of an apartment building and the toilet is broken, so they're screaming up at their landlord, who incidentally looks like everybody in this room, wearing fancy suits and looking wealthy and, hanging out with movie stars, as I know you all do. And they're saying, fix my toilet. And he's saying, well, just vote for me in the next election, I'll fix your toilet. And so they try and fix their toilet, and then they pour down liquid plumber, then they call in a plumber and they pay $50, which they don't have, and it doesn't get fixed. So one day they walk down the street and they get 3 sticks of dynamite and they throw it down the toilet and they light it on fire. And they say, this might explode my toilet and my whole apartment, it's gonna get your attention. And that's Donald Trump. Like, it's not that people don't know how explosive he is for our country and how dangerous he is for our country, but they're so mad at this system and they're so done with trying to fix it that they're giving up, and they're saying, at least this will break the man, it will get your attention. And that's what I think the heart of it is, not Ocasio-Cortez.
Okay. Then we'll open up the floor, of course, to questions from all of you. And thank you for that answer. I think that there is also still a little bit of that, but we agree to disagree, which is, of course, wonderful. Now, let's talk about the actual election, where we are. First, I have to ask you the question: do you think that Kamala has a chance to win? Do you think that Trump has a chance to win? Where are we? Is it still that close or not that close?
Well, let's ask Danielle. What do you think?
No. We asked. Danielle is eating this dessert.
Danielle just
Danielle
said
is
to me,
eating this dessert.
Kamala is definitely going to win, no question about it. So I love that. But
So. No, but okay, but we're creating a little bit of.
sorry.
Okay, let me put the microphone here. We are innovating, Kerry.
I believe that a bunch of Republicans, old-fashioned Republicans, will not vote.
won't vote. They just
Like-
won't
like-
not vote.
Like what happened with Hillary. A bunch of Democrats who spent the ballot didn't show up to vote.
Yeah. No, I think
Okay,
that's.
but what is your take
So,
on this?
what I think is,
What are the
first of all,
chances of Kamala winning?
If I were Kamala right now or Donald Trump right now, I'd rather be Kamala because technically she's a little bit ahead, but it's very, very, very small numbers. This election is not about persuasion. This election is about get out the vote. It is about who's more organized on the ground, who knows where your voters are, who knows how they're gonna get to the polls on election day, who's making sure they're picking them up, picking up their dog, picking up their kid at school, making sure that that person is going to vote, taking them home and making sure that happens. What gives me hope, and this is just a very technical answer, this isn't about my heart or my view of what should happen. But I think Kamala just made $1 billion in whatever it was, 6 weeks or 7 weeks. And I've never, ever, ever seen a campaign that wasn't dying for money. This is the first time I've ever seen a campaign where they're flush with money and trying to figure out how to spend it. So I think that they've got the funds, I think that it's gonna be a question of who's more organized on the ground in those swing states.
So, very quickly on some of the issues that are being debated. Immigration, for example. Trump is really harsh on Kamala on immigration. Was it only her fault if a bill on immigration was not produced, and what is her position? So
Okay, we all know that there was a bipartisan immigration bill, which incidentally I personally was completely against, and I'm glad it didn't pass. But
why were you against that?
oh, because it was so oppressive. It was so oppressive. But that said, I mean, Trump said, it's everything we want as Republicans. Don't pass it because that's going to make it, because I want that issue for the election. I mean, how cynical is that? And he's so open about it. And anyway, I think it's hard to imagine more weak-kneed, chicken, horrible Republican leaders to just bend to that and bow to it and say, well, okay, it's not, we know that's not what's good for our country. We know this isn't why we were elected, but we're gonna do it because he's somebody we disrespect is saying we should do it.
So let's talk about the consequences, independently of or rather, according to who wins, whether it's Kamala or it's Trump. For example, for Europe, you know Europe very well. You're active, as I mentioned before, in Spain, in Switzerland, in Greece, in other countries, and in Italy especially. So you know what's going on there. So what is your mission with your foundation in Europe, and what do you think the scenario is for Ukraine, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship if Kamala or Trump wins?
Right, well, this is quite clear. Trump has said he wants out of NATO, and he will allow Putin to do whatever he wants in Ukraine. Now, if you think Putin stops at Ukraine, forget it. Latvia, Moldova, all Eastern Europe, Serbia, they're all right there behind it, and not to mention Georgia and the former Soviet states. It's a complete disaster. For the EU, it would be a total disaster. You guys are all in finance. You know what this would do to the security of the financial system if Trump were elected. The good news for people in finance is, I mean, if you think about it this way, is your taxes will be lowered and there won't be as many regulations. The bad news is that won't matter because the entire financial system may collapse under what he has said quite openly he's going to do. He said he'll be a dictator on day one. He said he's going to put U.S. troops into our city streets if there's a protest, and he's going to send the IRS, which he's already compiled, a list of people he considers his political enemies, not people who have fomented violence or called for violence, but just who have been against, criticized him, that he's going to send the IRS after them and after their nonprofit organizations. He's very, very, very dangerous. And then in the economic realm, he said that he will cut Social Security. And he's going to cut Medicare, Medicaid, and get rid of the Affordable Care Act. And most people in this room are Italian, so you get your health care from the state. But people in the United States, as you know, that's not the system we live under. If you're over 65 and just looking around this room as somebody who recently joined you depend on Medicare. That is your healthcare system. So it's just gonna be destroyed. And what's that gonna do to our society? Anyway, I could go.
Yeah, we are almost out of time, so please get ready with some of the questions. My last question, and yes, I would ask you to be as tight as possible so we give space to our audience is about the Middle East, staying on the foreign policy side. Do you think that after what happened in the recent killing in Sinwar and certain openings from Israel said, if the terrorists will release the hostages, then maybe we'll move into more of a dialogue. Do you think that there is a possibility of a ceasefire, or that we have to wait for the election results, or what is your take anyway on that other explosive situation?
I think that this is an opening for a ceasefire, for sure. I think that Netanyahu is resistant to that. I think he understands that the day there's a ceasefire, it's his last day of office. So that's very dangerous for him. But I also think that this is our best chance that we've had.
Thank you. Questions? Yes.
My name is David Mazzucchi. I'm a reporter with La Voce di New York, which is an Italian-English digital daily. So I have a quote here from, staying on the Middle East, I have a quote here from Pope Francis from last month where he opined on the situation there. He said, when there is something disproportionate, there is a dominating tendency that goes beyond morality. A country that does these things, speaking about Israel, and I'm talking about any country, but it's like he was speaking in the context of what was going on now. I'm talking about any country. In a superlative way, these are immoral actions. As a Catholic and a human rights defender, what do you think of the Holy See's opinion on this?
A brief question, what's going on around the world, all the wars that are going on, human rights, where in the world will be the most explosive occurrence that will take place, considering that there are shooting going on halfway around the world? Is be Russia, in the Middle East, in the East, or back here in the United States if Trump gets elected?
Or, I'm sorry, I would add also Africa, people overlook, in Gaza, tens of thousands are dying, in Africa, millions are dying, including children.
I wanted to have your opinion about two cards that Trump may have on J.D. Vance and Elon Musk. How much do you think that on the first case he may attract the swing states? And on the other side, Elon Musk, how much he can attract maybe on the West Coast or other voters? So,
Israel was sustained a vicious, horrific, unprovoked attack on October 7th, in which women were raped and hostages were taken and children were killed. It was horrendous. And it has a right to protect itself. That said, it has to be in compliance with the international human rights norms when it protects itself. And as we've seen from the ICC and others, there's been very credible reports and there are investigations into whether or not those have been legal. So that I think we have to assure that when, as the international community, we have to assure that people are in compliance with international law. Now, Hamas 100% has violated international law, so they need to be held accountable. And to say one does and one doesn't in this, and you have to say them both in the same breath. Hamas is a terrorist organization. My father was killed by a terrorist organization. You have to stop them. So that's what I would say about that. The second question was...
The second was about other places where there is violence from other regions.
Oh, other regions.
The US
Oh,
and
as
Africa.
Mario just pointed out, I mean, for sure it's Sudan, where hundreds of millions of people are being killed and displaced every single day. So that is the most explosive part of the world right now. It's not in the headlines, but it is the way Ukraine and the Middle East are, but that is the most exposed place. I think
So can you repeat where? Sorry, I missed it.
Sudan.
Oh, Sudan, okay.
Sudan.
Sorry.
I think that region of Africa is extremely explosive and really dangerous. But I also think that, you know, we have to approach these things, change in our country and in our world in a holistic way. So you can't just say, well, we're gonna get peace in Ukraine and it's done. We need to get peace in Ukraine and Sudan and the Middle East. But we also have to address women and girls in school. And if we don't address girls in school, we're not going to be able to address child slavery. And if we don't address that, we need to address child slavery if we want to address dignity in the workplace and diversity and inclusion in the workplace. We have to address all this at once. Let me give you one other example. We work at RK Human Rights. We work with the investment industry. So the investment industry controls $111 trillion worldwide, $111 trillion. So we work with about 250 people who control about 7 trillion. The worldwide investment industry, $111 trillion, how much of that is controlled by women and underrepresented minorities? Less than 2%. Less than 2%. All the rest of it is basically old white men. So we're not gonna fix everything else in the world until we also fix the investment industry. So all I'm saying is, Daniele is working so hard on cancer. We have to fix our healthcare system. We have to fix everything all at once. And we have to have wonderful arts, and we have to do all of this all at once. So I guess what I'm saying is, it doesn't really matter what your choice is of how you're gonna spend your time making the world better. You just have to choose something and try and make the world a better place with the thing you choose. And that's gonna help all of us make all of the world better in all the places we choose.
Thank you. So the last question. The other question was about the West, the Vance and Musk, and how important are they to
I mean, I think it's interesting about J.D. Vance. He is really not respected across the board. So, you know, I mean, you really couldn't have chosen a worse person for vice president. The vice president, the role of vice president is to reflect. You know, people think, well, a vice president will help you bring that person's state, but that hasn't happened since 1960 when John Kennedy chose Lyndon Johnson. Since then, there's not one single case of a vice president bringing along their state in a way that they wouldn't have wanted to otherwise. But what the vice president does do is it reflects upon the choices of the president. So it helps define the president. And J.D. Vance is a total disaster. You could choose almost anyone else, just walk down the street and choose anyone other than him, and you would do better by Donald Trump. He brought Trump down, not up. You can't do that. I mean, really. So I don't think he helps. I mean, I haven't seen any polls that he helps Trump. I might be wrong, but anyway.
and Musk?
And Musk. Musk makes a difference because he's extremely wealthy and he pours the money in, and also X is influential. I want to say one other thing about Musk that I think is more important, because we had talked before this, Mario and I, about misinformation and disinformation. And there's a lot of, I've seen a lot of newspaper articles, as all of you have, about Russian interference and Middle East interference in our election. But they are nothing compared to domestic interference in our elections and disinformation. But how does that get out there? 5 platforms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those platforms, all we have to do as a country, all we have to do is regulate those platforms. Really easy to do, as a matter of fact. You just have to regulate them. And we're not regulating them. And we're not regulating them because the Republicans don't want to regulate them because they see that they're helpful in their elections. And that's really the big problem. And that's also a huge disservice to our country.
Well, thank you. It's 4:00. Maybe we have time for, yes.
What do you think about your brother's choice to support Donald Trump?
There is a day after. We don't know who's going to win. We might not even have a winner the next day or a week later, but there has to be a process of healing in this country. What do you think is going to happen? It's not just short-term, the election. Something has to happen that is a little bit deeper. Thank you.
My question is, if your father had become president, do you think he will have opened again investigation on the killing of President Kennedy? And then of the two, between Harris and Trump, who do you think will act on this? Your brother said that he chose to support Trump also for that.
I love my brother. We all have to love our family members. I also like Bobby a tremendous amount. I completely disagree with him on this issue. And I think that it's everything Donald Trump stands for is anathema to the values that the Kennedy family has been working on for 5 generations. So I've been very clear about that. But this election is not about Bobby Kennedy. It's about Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. And that's what we have to focus on. How do we heal? That's the best question. How do we heal? And I think part of that healing is not treating each other as them, as the other, but trying to understand where people are coming from, like that whole description that I gave of what it means to, I think there's a lot of people, I know you're gonna kill me for this, but it won't be as long as the last one. But I think there's a lot of people that there's a demographic shift going on in our country. So a lot of people are going into the schools that they went to and saying that as children and saying, this doesn't look like what it used to look like. And they're going into their places of worship and looking around and saying, this doesn't look like what it looked like. And they're Main Street and saying, this is completely different. And then that's not something about the future, that's the present. They're saying, where do I fit in? Who am I? Who am I? This is scary. I don't know where I fit in. I don't know who I am in this context. So we have to address people's hearts and their emotions before, and we have to treat each other as human beings before we can start to heal. It's about reaching out to one another. My cousin Tim Shriver is doing excellent work on this if you want to see some.
Conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I mean, I think my father had more important things to worry about, and our country has more important things to worry about than that. That is a distraction from what's important in our country, from the fact that children don't have food to eat, that people can't pay for their groceries, that our hearts are broken. And that's what we need to do, and not go down these stupid conspiracy theories.
Good, let's hope for a feeling. Thank you, Kerry. And thank you all for having been here.